Hey listeners, welcome back to another out-of-world news story with Revolving Time. Time is a fascinating and universal concept that affects every aspect of our lives. Uncover the hidden secrets and truths. This is a story of my long-time marriage disappears in a flash. My ex and I wound up a divorce statistic after 26 years of marriage, the first 25 of which I thought were wonderful. I hope you all enjoying this long story. Okay, let's go on to story. Remember that scene in The Godfather when Michael Corleone sees a beautiful woman in Italy and kind of goes into a stupor? His two Sicilian bodyguards see it and start talking about how he's been hit by the thunderbolt and he's lost in love. That's not just a made-up movie thing. I've seen it firsthand, although at the time I wasn't aware of what it was. It happened to my wife. Unfortunately for me, it didn't happen to her upon meeting me. It happened with another man 25 years after we were married and was the beginning of the end of what I thought was a perfect life. I'm getting ahead of myself. I do that when I think of my former life and how things were supposed to go, but didn't. I suppose I should start at the beginning and introduce myself. I'm Alan Gregorson. Everyone calls me Greg. I'm 50 years old and I live in a small Midwestern city about 2 hours from Chicago. I'm an accountant for a pretty big national firm. It's kind of mind-numbing work, but the pay is great. With the exception of March and April, the hours are usually right on the money at 40, with no weekends. I was married up until 2 years ago. My ex and I had one child together, a daughter, Morgan, who's 25, married, has one child, and lives in Denver. My ex and I wound up a divorce statistic after 26 years of marriage, the first 25 of which I thought were wonderful, as I already told you. I met Tracy at Iowa State University in Ames, Iowa, in the fall of my sophomore year. She was also a sophomore, but had transferred into my dorm after her freshman year in another dorm. I spotted her lithe, athletic body outside the dorm, lying on a towel soaking up some of Iowa's strong August sunshine. I was walking into the dorm with some friends when I spotted her out of the corner of my eye. Guys, I gotta go. I'm about to introduce myself to the future Mrs. Gregorson, I said, not entirely in jest. The two friends I was with followed my gaze to Tracy. Wow, said one of them. I heard the words, but I couldn't tell you which one of them was talking. I was totally taken with this blonde goddess lying on a towel in a bikini off to the side of the door. I just left my two friends and went over to introduce myself, but when I got about 4 feet from her, she got up on one elbow and started waving me off with her other hand. I was crushed until she spoke up. Hey, dumbass, you're in my sun. I immediately jumped about a foot to my right, which allowed the sun to fall back onto my goddess. She lit me up with a megawatt smile, and at that moment I might have committed any crime she wanted me to. Much better, dumbass, she giggled. She didn't seem uncomfortable with a strange guy approaching her. I guess when you look like that it probably happens all the time. I introduced myself to her, told her I thought she was beautiful, and asked her out on a date for the next Friday night. If I say yes, will you wipe the drool off of your chin? She asked coyly. What? Yes, the drool, the drool. Sure, gone immediately, I responded like a lummox in heat. Well, I can definitely see you're not one of the slick ones with a line for everything, so sure, we can go out on Friday night. I got her phone number. We hit a small Italian place in Ames that Friday night, and while I sat there like a love-struck puppy, she proceeded to tell me everything about her life from the time she was 3 years old until the present. I think she only stopped talking because the main course was finally served. We just seemed to click, and inside of a month we were together almost constantly during our free time. Not only was she smart, but she had a puckish sense of humor and a quiet confidence. I felt I was a decent-looking guy, nothing world-class, but I was fairly athletic, smart, and I could carry on an intelligent conversation about a broad base of topics. Although as Tracy pointed out, I wasn't one of those guys with a slick line for everything. I was pretty confident in myself, but I knew I was reaching way over my pay grade when I asked her out. Hey, you get nothing if you don't ask, right? Tracy and I had our first 53x on our 6th date. Neither one of us were virgins, but I know I hadn't had more than a handful of partners to that point, and I kind of got the impression that it was the same thing for Tracy. Update: Tracy and I got married soon after we graduated. We both found jobs easily, she as a 3rd grade teacher and me as an accountant. We had good solid incomes, bought a house a couple of years later, and had our only child, a daughter, almost a year to the day we moved into the house. Life was good. Our 53x life, while not being anything wild, was varied and plentiful enough for both of us, although like many couples, time and age does take its toll on the frequency. Still, when Morgan left for college, we were still going at it with gusto 3 or 4 times a week. Through the years, I had my moments where I worried about Tracy being true to me, but those were very few and far between. Like she might say something about one of the new young teachers in her school being a little flirty, but she never gave me any indication that she ever responded back or anything went further, so I always attributed that to my own paranoia. I mean, I'm not blind. The woman is still hot, and I couldn't blame any man for at least taking another look at her, but just a look. There's no sharing in my world. I made that quite clear to Tracy way back. When we first became exclusive, she responded in kind, telling me she felt the same exact way. She didn't mind if I looked at another woman, but if there was ever any touching, there would be hell to pay. I was more than okay with that, and that's the way things were until 3 years ago. We were at the annual summer party put on by our neighbors 3 doors down in our trendy neighborhood. Scott and Wendy Harris always put on an all-day bash at their place the weekend after the 4th of July. Tracy and I attend every year, as do most of the neighbors on the block, and we always have a great time. Scott and Wendy are excellent hosts. The food and booze are great. They have a large in-ground pool and a sand volleyball court. Even the outsiders they invite are good people, with one exception. But again, I'm getting ahead of myself. The party starts at noon, and Tracy and I wandered over about 1. I went to the bar, got a white sin for Tracy and a Michelob for myself, and we started mingling, at first together. Then we separated as we each got absorbed in the various conversations going on both inside and outside of the house. Never an issue before. Every now and then I'd check back in with Tracy to see if she needed a refill, a plate of munchies, whatever. Sometimes she would find me. We usually left each other with a quick peck on the lips. I was talking with a group of male neighbors and Tracy was just across the yard talking with a group of women when a small group of outsiders showed up in the yard. It was a man with 2 women, and Scott went up to greet the trio. And that's when I saw the thunderbolt hit Tracy. After looking at the new trio, I just happened to look at Tracy, who had stopped talking to her friends and was intently watching the new people with a look on her face that I can now say was a cross between amazement and pure lust. I really didn't have a clue as to what kind of look it was at the time, only that she looked awestruck, and I have to admit my spider senses started tingling. She watched the trio for about 10 seconds, then she turned in my direction, spotted me, looked me directly in the eyes, and blushed a deep red. She then turned back to her friends and got involved in the conversation again. Did you ever get one of those funny feelings that things aren't quite right with the world, but you can't put your finger quite on what's not right? That's the feeling I got about an hour later, and I didn't feel any better when I scanned the yard and couldn't find Tracy. I went to the bar and picked up a white wine for her and started to wander around, and finally found her in the Harris's den with 4 other people, including the guy who Tracy had been gawking at earlier. In fact, he had his arm casually draped around my wife's back, with his hand resting on her right hip. That looked way too comfortable for me, especially considering she had apparently just met this guy, and the 5 of them seemed to be in friendly conversation. I'm confident in myself and was completely trusting of my wife, and I didn't want to cause a scene, but I felt this was just a little too hands-on for the newcomer. I approached the group from behind Tracy and her new pal, and I put a solid grip on his wrist as I removed it from her hip. I don't believe we've met yet, despite the fact that you obviously feel way too comfortable with my wife, I said with a hard edge to my voice. He started to spin away from me, but the death grip I had on his wrist prevented him from going anywhere. Tracy, who appeared to be flushed before I went up to the group, got even redder when she realized I was right there. "Oh, Greg, please," she kind of squealed when she realized I was squeezing the offending wrist. "Greg, this is Charles Delane. He teaches European literature at the college. He started there last year. He's French." He didn't do anything out of line, so I just left his hand where it was. The others in the group were nodding their assent, so I let go of Charles' wrist and grabbed his hand in a firm handshake, crushing a few of the middle hand bones together as I did so. Tracy then introduced me to the others in the group, kind of like an afterthought. "Thought you might need a refill," I said to her as I handed her the glass of wine while looking directly at Charles. "You are so considerate, my dear husband," she replied. Charles, pronounced the French way, Charles looked like typical Euro trash to me. I have to admit he was a fairly good-looking guy of about 32, about 6 feet tall and 170 pounds, with a 3-day growth of a spindly beard, and was somewhere between having long hair and needing a haircut. He had the full French accent on his English, and I thought to myself that he was probably sleeping with half of his students. After the introductions, he went back to expounding on Victor Hugo or somebody, and satisfied that I had made my presence felt, I wandered back outside to the yard. Tracy and Charles made it to the backyard for the start of the sand volleyball. I was always a major player in these games, and as we played winner's court, my team spent a lot of time playing. We always had a pretty good crowd watching from the safety of the deck, and that's where my wife settled with Charles right next to her. I was a little busy with what was going on in the games to pay a lot of attention to the pair, but I did notice a lot of hand and arm touch, smiling, and an occasional blush from my wife. I would occasionally wave over to her, and she would wave back. My team had won several games and was still holding the court an hour later when I noticed that Tracy and Charles were no longer in their seats. I glanced at the bar and at the grill area and didn't see them either. My spider senses were tingling to beat the band, so I got one of the other guys to sub in for me, telling my team that my 47-year-old legs were getting tired and that I badly needed a beer. I took a lot of good-natured old man ribbing as I left the sand. To keep up the pretense, I headed over to the bar and got another Mitch. Then I meandered around the yard for a bit before heading into the house. I went through every room that was opened and I listened very hard at the doors of the 2 rooms that were closed, but I neither saw nor heard Tracy nor Charles. I finally meandered over to the hostess, Wendy, and innocently asked if she'd seen my wife in the last few minutes. Yeah, she and Charles went out to look at something in his car, I think, Wendy answered offhandedly. What does he drive? I inquired somewhat testily. That's when the light bulb went on above Wendy's head. We'd been neighbors and friends for more than 15 years. She got a very concerned look on her face and she answered, "Gray Saab." I ducked outside and looked both ways down the street. No Saab in sight. Just then Wendy joined me in the driveway. "I'm sure it's nothing, Greg," she said in her most soothing voice. "They probably just popped over to the college for a sec." "Yeah, thanks. Probably nothing," I said without much conviction. I turned and walked off. The local college was 5 minutes from the house. I'd go see for myself. I drove over to the school and drove through every parking lot they had. No Saab. I called Tracy's cell. It went straight to voicemail, which meant that she was either talking to someone else or it was turned off. I left a message. I left 4 more messages over the next hour as I sat in my house. I also called her parents and her sister, asking if they had heard from her today. They all said no. The old Sherlock Holmes quote came to mind: once you eliminate the impossible, whatever remains, no matter how improbable, must be the truth. I crawled into my lazy boy in the family room and stared at the blank big screen for hours. I didn't need to turn on the TV to see any images, because in my mind's eye I could see my gorgeous wife being ducked silly by this French bass. Why the duck did we save that country in 2 world wars? Should have let the Germans keep the place. I didn't sleep a wink all night as I just sat in the chair and stared at the TV. I half expected Tracy to slink into the house in the middle of the night, but when that didn't happen I thought just maybe Charles had gotten into a car wreck with Tracy in the car. I called the local sheriff's office at about 8 a.m., told them who I was, and asked if they had any wrecks during the night. I was told they didn't. I called Tracy's phone another 4 times, got nothing another 4 times. As noon approached, I heard a car pull up in the driveway, and a person got out, judging by only one door slamming. About 45 seconds later, Tracy put her key in the lock, opened the door, and walked in. Another few seconds later, she spotted me in the family room and quietly sat down on the sofa on the other side of the room. If I had any doubts about what they were doing, those were quickly put to rest by her appearance. At least she had the decency to have showered before coming home. Her long blonde hair, hanging free yesterday, was drawn back into a ponytail, which appeared damp, and she was completely devoid of any makeup. She was wearing the yellow sundress she was wearing yesterday, and the skin of her chest, shoulders, and arms was glowing pink. She had the satisfied look of a woman well ducked, and I have to admit she looked gorgeous. She also didn't look the least bit remorseful or guilty, and if anything, seemed to have a condescending smirk on her face. "Nice of you to show up. Have a good time last night. And this morning?" I sneered. "Actually, I did," she replied smugly. "That wasn't exactly the answer I was expecting to hear. Look, Greg," she continued calmly, "have you ever in your life just had the most amazing physical and emotional connection with someone from the minute you saw them? I mean completely amazing, almost electric, and wonderful, and amazing." "Yes, I have," I answered immediately. "I married that woman." That was not exactly the answer she was expecting to hear, because her completely placid demeanor was finally shattered. Her almost glassy-eyed calm broken. Her eyes finally showed some recognition of the depth of my despair. I met mine yesterday. I can't explain it. I have to have him. I love him. Just like that." "Are you ducking nuts?" I screamed. "You throw away 25 years of marriage because of a feeling. Did I mean absolutely nothing to you?" I'm not sure why she wasn't expecting my explosion. She started to sob uncontrollably at my outburst. "I didn't care. I do love you, Greg," she finally choked out. "What we've had together has been great, but this is just the most amazing connection I've ever had with anyone in my entire life. I love you, but I'm in love with him. It's amazing, amazing. I get it. Give me a little time to get used to it and I'll throw you a ducking party. I spat at her. So do you want to file or should I? I continued. It will be an even split regardless, and we'll sell the house and split that money, too. I don't think we need to rush into anything like divorce just yet, she said, more than a hint of exasperation in her voice. Let's just see how this plays out a little bit. We can make the big decisions down the road. It was my turn to be exasperated. What? I whined. That's not how this works. You don't get to keep me as a backup plan. If you're ducking him, you can have him as soon as possible. As far as I'm concerned, we were done when you ducked him the first time yesterday. Ducking him multiple times since then just adds to my resolve. But, she sputtered. Fine, then. I'll file, and I'll move out by the end of the week. True to my word, I had my stuff out of the house by the end of the week. I took a couple of personal days off from work and got it done. While I was loading up my pickup one evening, Scott and Wendy Harris came down the block and apologized to me for inviting Charles to their party. I stopped them politely, pointing out to them that they had no way of knowing that Trasnight was going to go off the deep end with this guy. Still, we can't help but feel responsible, Wendy said as she and Scott looked at their shoes. My lawyer had divorce papers drawn up and Trasai was served inside of a month. Apparently she figured I was going to take her advice and drag my feet, because my lawyer told me the process server said she had a fit when he handed her the papers, which explains why 2 days later she showed up at my new apartment and barged right in when I answered the door to her ringing the bell. How could you do this if you love me as much as you say you do? She railed as she walked into my apartment. I was shocked at first but quickly recovered as anger took over. Are you seriously stupid? I yelled back at her. You're ducking another man. What did you expect me to do? I may love you, and if this doesn't work out, what am I supposed to do then? Just give me a little time. If this doesn't work out, I will come back to you and be the best wife ever. We can grow old together. You're delusional, I shot back at her. I'm not giving you permission to duck your dream guy until you figure out if it works for you. Besides, if he's your dream guy, why wouldn't it work out? Charles has a wife he's divorcing, and they've got some financial issues to settle. Translation. Her may be Mr. Right for you, but you may not be his Mrs. Right. I questioned, more sputtering on her part before I finally told her to get her cheating out of my apartment or I would throw her out on that cheating egg. Trass and her attorney did everything they could to slow the process down. In the meantime, Mr. Wonderful moved into my old house and took my place. Update 1. 4 months later, I'm walking out of Shay Mitchell's with an associate after a business dinner when I spot a familiar face, actually 2 faces, moving toward the door. It was Charles and an obviously pregnant Trasai. She looked to be about 3 months along. I stopped in my tracks and gawked, blocking their entrance into the restaurant. Oh my God, I muttered half under my breath. My business associate had stopped along with me and seemed very confused as the 4 of us stood face to face. Serge, I'd like you to meet my wife, at least for a few more months, and her lover, Charles Delane. Serge was in the unenviable position of having to be polite in an extremely uncomfortable situation. I thought he handled himself well. He mumbled. She's pregnant. Is that yours? That is most definitely his, I answered brightly. You're an ass. Greg. You know that, was all she said as she and Charles stepped past us and into the restaurant. I found out later from Wendy Harris that Trasai was indeed 3 months along. Apparently Charles was such a wonderful man that Trasai wanted to have his child and went off birth control. Good luck with that, was all I said to Wendy. The divorce got done several months later, and 2 months after that, Trasai brought a son into this world. Of course they named him Charles Jr. Because when you are so wonderful, what better way to tell the world than by naming another human being after yourself? Our daughter Morgan wasn't exactly happy over Trasai's decision to have another child at this point in life, especially since her parents weren't together and I wasn't the father. I'll admit to being proud of my daughter for taking my side in this mess. While I knew she had the baby, I hadn't talked to Trasai or seen her since running into her at the restaurant all those months ago. I suppose I knew it would happen eventually, since we both lived in town, but I have to admit I was more than a little surprised the first time I saw Trasai after she had given birth. The extra weight gain didn't look good on her, and it looked like the whole experience had been tough on her now 49-year-old body. I almost walked right past the somewhat grandly woman pushing the stroller with what looked to be a 1-year-old boy in it in the mall in town. Come on, Greg, there's no reason to be downright rude, said a more than familiar voice as I hurried by the pair one Saturday afternoon. I stopped dead in my tracks and despite trying not to, I did an almost slow motion double take at the woman and the baby. Oh shit, this was Trasai and her son. Hey, stranger, I said as I tried to gather my wits about me. Hey yourself, she responded back. Of course the baby was beautiful. He had Trasai's hair and eye color, but his father's slightly darker complexion. "Wow, Mom, he's beautiful," I said truthfully. Trasai blushed lightly and thanked me for the compliment. "I haven't seen you in a while, and well," pushing a stroller, I said in apology for not realizing who she was at first. Although she flinched visibly when I apologized for not immediately recognizing her, she did well to let it pass without comment. While I found her to be incredibly 53XY after Morgan's birth many years ago, she was more than 20 years older now, and with this baby not being my kid, I guess my hormones were very much in check. We chatted amicably for a few more minutes, mostly about her not getting enough sleep, and I detected a note of real sadness, something she never displayed after Morgan's birth. I finally made my apology, then left to continue shopping for what I had gone for in the first place. The next time I saw Trask was at the Harrises' summer party about 6 months later. Scott and Wendy had always felt terrible that it was at their party that Trasai met Charles, but I told them then and meant it then I didn't blame them for Trasai's poor decision. Nevertheless, Wendy kept trying to fix me up with her single and divorced friends, and I have to admit, some of those fix-ups were pretty good. Anyway, they kept inviting me back to the annual summer party, and after skipping the last two, I decided to go again, even though they warned me that Trasai and Charles would be there as well. I told them that if there were any problems, I wouldn't be the one causing them, and I meant that. I was at the party for a couple of hours when I saw Trasai and Charles enter the backyard. Since the baby wasn't with them, I assumed it was with a sitter. Trasai had lost some of her pregnancy weight and didn't look quite as grandmotherly as the last time I saw her, but I just couldn't get over the look of sadness in her once bright blue eyes. Even when I saw her smile, something was missing from her eyes. I got the elephant out of the room early by going up to Trasai and Charles, giving her a light hug and shaking his hand. I think they were both taken slightly aback, and I think I saw Wendy holding her breath as I walked toward the pair. We chit-chatted for maybe a minute, then I begged my pardon and went back to my band of brothers by the grill. When the sand volleyball started, I got on one of the teams. My team played the second game, and while I was in the sand, I noticed Trasai sit down in a chair to watch and cheer. I didn't see Mr. Wonderful. We played 2 games, losing the second, so we had to vacate the court and wait for our next turn. While I was getting a beer, I looked over at Trasai just sitting there by herself. Old habits are hard to break, I thought to myself. I grabbed my beer and headed inside. The third room I checked in was the den, and sure enough, I was right on the money. Charles had his arm around Marilyn Jansen's waist while he was talking in a small group, and for her part Marilyn was looking at him with lust in her eyes. Marilyn was a former neighbor of mine from just down the street, and she was most definitely married. I should have minded my own damn business, I thought to myself. If this is what I think it is, he's going to duck this woman tonight and cheat on Trasai. If I don't tell her, I'm wrong. If I do tell her, there's going to be hell to pay and I'll still be wrong. A true friend would say something to her, but I wasn't a true friend, I was her ex-husband. Why should it be my responsibility? And then fate took that decision away from me. Marilyn's husband, Troy, was on my sand volleyball team, and apparently he had followed me inside to talk to me about some strategy. When he spotted the same thing that I did, Charles with his arm around his wife, and his wife looking at Charles like he was dipped in honey. "You son of a bitch, get your hands off my wife," he screamed at Charles as he lunged toward the pair. I started to move to block the impending fracas, but then good sense came to my aid and I let my volleyball teammate shoot past me. Before Charles could pull away from his wife, Troy had grabbed Charles' arm. They showed up about 10 minutes later with 2 cops in tow. The cops took statements from everyone who was in the room at the time, in case Charles wanted to file charges against Troy Jansen. The senior member of the team was a Sergeant Jim Hill, who looked to be about my age. The junior member was Officer Kathleen McDonald, who looked to be about 40 and every bit as Irish as her name suggested, with freckles, green eyes, and long orange hair. I made sure I went over to Officer McDonald's side of the room so I could give my statement to her. In the middle of this scene was a crying Trasai. McDonald saw Trasai waiting on me, so she questioned me next. I gave her my take on what went down, including letting her know that Charles had stolen my wife at this party 3 years ago. She looked surprised at my comment. "And you're still going to take her to the hospital to be with him?" she questioned. "Are you just that nice of a guy or a complete idiot?" Got to admit I didn't see that coming. I looked up into her face and saw she was stifling a smile. "Complete idiot," I answered. She didn't see that one coming either and let out a small chuckle. I liked the sound of that. A couple more questions later, I was done giving my statement. She told me I could take Trasai to the hospital, but before I left she warned me that Trasai would probably not believe me if I told her my story. "Don't expect her to," I answered. I started to turn away, and she started to move to the next person for a statement, but a quick thought jumped into my head and then into my mouth. Maybe you should give me your card in case I remember something else, officer. She grinned back at me, her eyes practically glowing. She took a card out of the top left pocket of her uniform shirt, flipped it over, and wrote what I assumed to be her personal phone number. Thank you, officer, I chuckled back at her, then put on my game face and turned toward Trasai. Let's go. On the way to the hospital, Trasai asked me what happened to Charles. I told her the truth and wasn't surprised when she didn't believe me. Can't you just let it go, Greg? She whined. It's been 3 years now. It's not about letting it go, Trace, I responded. Charles shouldn't have had his hands on Marilyn Jansen, and Troy was right to do what he did. Hell, maybe if I had been that bold, you and I would still be together. Neither of us expected that to come out of my mouth. Tears formed in the corners of Trasai's eyes before she turned her head away from me in the pickup. I dropped Trasai off at the emergency room and didn't go in with her. She would have to get an Uber for the ride back to the small home she and Charles shared since we sold off our home and split the proceeds after the divorce went through. With her out of my hair for the night, I reached into my shirt pocket for the card Officer Kathleen McDonald had given me earlier. A bonny lass, I thought to myself. I was trying to play it cool, so I waited 3 days before I called Officer Kathleen McDonald. She answered on the second ring. Could you have waited any longer? I could have already gotten engaged and been married by now, she taunted me over the phone. I suppose you're right, but if you move that fast, then you're never going to be the next and final Mrs. Alan Gregorson, I responded. Now who's being cheeky? She came back at me. How do you know I'll even say yes when you ask me out? And no, I don't want to go to any freaking Irish pub on a date. She caught me off guard with her Irish pub comment, because in all honesty, that's what I had in mind. It just seemed like the thing to do, take an Irish girl to an Irish pub. She picked up on my hesitation and knew she had it called right. What the H is with you guys? Don't any of you have any creativity? You see flaming red hair and right away you all think Irish pub. I stuttered for a split second before I came up with my plan B. We had a top-notch Greek restaurant in the city that I absolutely loved, and Greek food is quite a step away from Irish. She thought for about a nanosecond before responding positively. Thanks for being a little creative on the rebound, she said. Once I turned down the Irish pub, most guys immediately go to Asian. I'm sorry, but I'm not a big fan of food that looks like it could be a haven for cockroaches. I guffawed out loud at that one, and I think that's when I knew I might have found someone to grow old with. We talked for another hour about everything and nothing. I found out she was actually 45 and had been divorced for 10 years. Seems her ex also had a problem with fidelity. She had a son who was a Michigan State sophomore, majoring in pre-law. Dinner on Saturday night was fabulous, and the company was fantastic. I picked her up at her house on the south side of town, and was practically blown away by how good my bonny lass looked in her LBD with 4 inches heels, curves in all the right places, a great pair of legs, a pretty face and all that bright red hair. The woman was a walking billboard for the term beautiful. We had another of those conversations that went everywhere and nowhere. I could have listened to that voice all night long. She didn't seem in too much of a hurry to find a husband, the same way I wasn't going to rush finding a wife. That made her relaxed and dangerous at the same time, because she had a cop's almost natural inquisitiveness. She asked some deep questions, and I could tell she was thinking along with listening to my answers. I drove her home after dinner. I didn't invite her over to my place, and when we got to her place she didn't invite me in either. We said our good nights on her doorstep. Then she quickly leaned in and gave me a soft kiss on my cheek. I know I blushed 3 shades of red, said goodnight and then floated to my car. I don't remember the drive home. Damn, I felt like I was 16 again. Her lips felt soft on my cheek, and I'm pretty sure she was wearing White Shoulders perfume. She called me Sunday morning, wanting to know if I wanted to join her for bagels and lox at her home. How could I turn down that invite? Wendy and Scott invited me over for dinner a few days later, as much to apologize for everything that went down and also to get my side of the story. Seems that Charles was threatening to sue them as well as Troy Jansen. This guy must think he's God's gift to women, Scott blurted out at one point. He is rather handsome, dear, and very charming. I've got to tell you that, Wendy said before Scott shot her lightning bolts from both eyes. Troy spent the rest of that weekend in jail before getting bailed out on Monday morning, the Harrises said. When he got home, Marilyn and their 2 kids weren't there. They had gone to stay with her mother a few towns over. Scott noted that the couple's 12-year marriage was probably over. Well, give Troy my number and let him know that I, of all people, understand what he's going through. I'll be there if he needs someone to talk to. And I've got his back when this thing ends up in court. We'll tell him, and I'm sure he'll appreciate that, Scott Harris said. And by the way, this was the last summer fling we're throwing. I can't take this kind of pressure. Wendy's eyes were fixated on the peas on her plate as Scott talked. I got the feeling that things weren't so great in Harrisland since the party. Update 2. When 47-year-old Wendy started sporting a baby bump in public a few months later, my suspicions were confirmed. I didn't have to guess who the father probably was, because Scott himself called me to tell me. Can you believe this? He practically screamed into the phone at me when I answered. That douchebag knocked up my wife. She's been sleeping with that bass since last year's party. Scott told me that he didn't have a clue until Wendy started throwing up every other morning. That was the pattern she'd had when she was pregnant with the couple's 2 children years ago. When Scott figured it out and called her on it, she admitted that she and Charles had been having an affair for more than a year, but most of the time she had made him wear a condom. They ran out one long weekend when they both had lined their way out of their homes and into a motel, and both figured that a few times bareback wouldn't hurt. Scott then asked me for the name of my attorney. Can I get a friends and family discount? He joked dryly. Charles and Wendy apparently had moved into an apartment near campus, leaving Tracy and her son to fend for themselves, Scott told me. Not my problem, I responded back. But then I hadn't figured on the female psyche. I was eating lunch at a nearby McDonald's when she came up to my table, hand in hand with her son. She put her tray of lunch on the table opposite me, and the child scrambled into the seat to my left. Hello, Tracy. Hello, CJ, I said to the pair. The child, now about 3, stuck out a clean hand for a proper handshake. I was impressed by how grown up he was trying to be, so I took the little hand in mine and gave it a good shake. Hello, sir, he said in his most dignified voice. Hello, Greg, Tracy added. He's really growing, I said to Tracy, looking at her son. You might have a 6-footer on your hands someday. I could see by her face that Tracy appreciated my effort at being civilized. But I could also see by her face that something was troubling her, and if she didn't get it cleared up her head was going to explode. Ask me already, I gently persuaded her while watching her son unwrap a cheeseburger. Did you ever really love me as much as you said you did? She began softly. Because if you did, then how come you didn't fight for me, like Troy did for Marilyn? How come you never asked me to come back, like someone who truly loved me would have? How come you haven't stopped by my house to see how me and my son are doing, and maybe invite us over for an evening? I didn't see that coming at all. Suddenly this was my fault. I sucked in a deep breath and shook my head. I wanted to remain calm and not confuse her with an angry blow-up. Woo-oh, I exhaled. So this whole thing is on me. Seriously, you're the wronged innocent party here. My voice started to get louder as I spoke. This is not what I wanted. I needed to make my point. Woo, I exhaled again while holding up my hand. If you recall, I had removed Charles' hand from your waist, but you insisted there was nothing going on and I shouldn't cause trouble. So because I had the utmost trust in you and your word, I didn't go any further. Pardon me for trusting you so completely. Had I known then what I know now, I wouldn't have trusted you. But you, the person I most trusted in all the world, lied to me, so I didn't fight for you. Then, when you came home the next day at noon, what could I say? The deed had already been done. Many times by the looks of you. So what was there to fight about at that point? You had given yourself to another man and broken our vows. There wasn't anything left for me to fight about. You made it abundantly clear. You made it pinpoint clear. This was your decision alone, and I had no say in it. So what was left to fight about? You were no longer mine. You were his. But you never even tried to change my mind, she whined, or make me stay. Nothing. If you really loved me, how many times did you have 53x with Charles that first night? In morning. I'll bet it was several, I said. Once was a terrible mistake, but maybe I could have taken you back. Twice was already a conscious choice. More than that was you breaking my heart and stomping it to pieces. And you had the nerve to tell me you had a great time. An amazing time, if I remember correctly. And that you and he had this almost supernatural connection. You weren't sorry about a damn thing. You know, lust and slut are spelled with the same 4 letters. So what was I supposed to do? Like the saying goes, if you love something, let it go. If it comes back, it was yours. If not, it never was. And then, just to rub it in, you have his kid at 48. I couldn't get you to agree to a second child in 25 years. But not only do you spread him easy for Mr. Wonderful, but then you let him knock you up. So this is about your bruised male ego, she said, perhaps a bit too snippily for my taste. My head came up quickly at that. But with said child sitting at the table with us, I didn't take the bait. No, what he did once you were his was your choice. You apparently loved him enough to want to have his baby, even if you never wanted another with me. Trust me, I got the message. We ate in silence for a few minutes. She looked tentative. I knew where this was heading. But somebody had to go there. So now what's your game plan? I finally asked. You and Charles never married. But he is listed as the child's father, right? At the very least you should go after him for child support. I'm going to let Wendy have him, Tracy said. But you're right, I should get child support from that cheating A. That's good advice. Do you ever think about us, sometimes? She added, how it would have been. Honestly, no, I responded quietly. You broke my heart so completely that I never wanted to think about what might have been. I have some great memories of our past life that I will treasure forever. But that's gone, and it was never coming back. We went back to eating. I was watching the boy play with his French fries. I remembered back to a time when our daughter Morgan did the same thing. He's a good kid. I'm glad something good came from that relationship. You know, even though we started out with this amazing connection, in the end we never quite connected the way you and I did. I mean, the 53X started out great. I won't lie about that, but we never grew together as a couple. Love never replaced the lust when the lust faded. And that's apparently when it hit her, that aha moment. She shook her head sadly. Tears started to form in the corners of her eyes. She traded in the warmth and security of love for the thunderbolt of lust. And like a true thunderbolt, it had its moment of brilliance before disappearing. Epilogue. My Bonnie lass and I just celebrated our 10th wedding anniversary with a trip to, of all places, Spain. I offered her the obligatory trip to her homeland. And after punching me in the arm hard enough to leave a mark, she decided that we needed to go warmer and spicier. Warmer and spicier aptly describes our relationship. We've got a few more years of working before we retire from the computer security firm we started together a few years ago. We've done quite well since I left the engineering field and she quit the police force to form the company. We're together almost constantly, both professionally and personally, and yet it never seems to get old. I know it sounds corny, but I think I love her more each day. Between our 2 kids, we now have 5 grandchildren, and despite the fact that one family lives in Denver, Co., and the other in Houston, TX, we still get to see the grandkids on a regular basis. I occasionally run into Tracy around town, but it's rare for us to say more than a few sentences to each other. She's busy doing the mom thing with CJ, who's around 13 now. She hasn't remarried to this point and rarely dates, says my daughter, who occasionally talks to her mother. Seems that Mr. Wonderful had to be dragged into jail kicking and screaming before he started paying child support on a regular basis. It seems to me that it's a sad life without many frills, but hey, we all make our choices in life and have to live with them. I'm certainly not going to apologize for moving forward with my life. Thank you for joining us on Revolving Time, where we bring you real-life stories that explore the complexities of the human experience. We hope that our stories have provided you with insights, inspiration, and a renewed appreciation for the power of human resilience. We believe that storytelling has the power to create understanding and empathy, and we are committed to continuing to share stories that challenge and expand our understanding of the world. We encourage you to subscribe to our channel and stay connected with our community. By subscribing, you will be the first to know about new stories and events, and you'll have access to a library of inspiring content. Thank you for being a part of our journey, and we look forward to sharing more powerful stories with you in the future.